This is a 1965 289 Cobra, and for sheer performance, there was nothing like it in the day. It dominated racing, and of course on the street it was really something. They even wrote a song about it, "Hey Little Cobra," if you remember that. And probably from those days when I decided I had to have a Cobra one day, and so here we are. Hi, I'm Bobby Rahal. And why don't you come with me and let me show you what's inside my car barn. After you. Hi, I'm Bobby Rahal, and I'm a proud member of the Board of Directors of the Petersen Automotive Museum in Los Angeles, California. And welcome to my man cave. Today I thought we'd take a quick tour of what's in this man cave, which is really the culmination of a lifetime spent around automobiles, whether it's racing cars or street cars, and the passion that I still have for this great segment of our society. There's a lot of trophies, pictures, posters, you name it here, that we'll have a chance to go through. And I'll try to explain to you why all these cars, why they're special to me, what is it that's individually special to me, because of course, as growing up as a young kid, around racing cars, around street cars, all these cars represented a certain stage in my life. So welcome, I hope you enjoy it. So as I mentioned, you'll find in my collection it's pretty eclectic. I mean, there's racing cars, there's street cars, all different types, but they all reflect a certain period of my life, and that's why I've collected them, frankly. This car is a pretty rare car. This is a Lotus 19, and this car was built in 1961, way before I started driving, but really, I actually saw this car race in Canada in 1962. And of course, that was a year after this car was driven by a young Canadian driver named Peter Ryan, who was really considered the up-and-coming Canadian that was going to represent Canada in the world of Formula One. And Peter, interesting story, was actually born in Philadelphia. His mother owned the Mont Tremblant ski area, which still exists today. And Peter got into racing. He was a skier, competitive skier as well, naturally. Got into racing, showed a lot of talent, and at a young age was basically committed to drive this car and represent Canada in those days. And they used to have a big sports car race prior to the Grand Prix in Canada. They had a sports car race. They called it the Players 200, or also the Canadian Grand Prix. And really, the creme de la creme of racing drivers around the world came to that race to compete. What really solidified Peter Ryan's reputation was in '61, he beat Sterling Moss and a few other world-class drivers in the same type of car at Mossport. And this is the car that he did that in. The Lotus 19 was really a big step up in terms of technology at the time in sports cars. This was actually what they did is they used the suspension off the Formula One car onto a tube frame that would have two seats, which you had to have in sports car racing at the time. And it was powered by a 2.5 liter four-cylinder Coventry Climax engine, which had already proven itself in international racing. 19 of these cars were made, but only 7 were made with a 2.5 liter Coventry Climax. And this was really the car to have in, say, 1960, 61, 62, just before they started putting American V8 engines into these same cars, which happened the following year, and then pretty much made these obsolete within a pretty short period of time. Part of the story that makes this car interesting, so Peter Ryan wins all these races, and he competed at the time against Roger Penske, Sterling Moss, I mean, you name it, the best of the best. And so he was sent to Europe at the end of the year to compete in European racing because, again, that was the place to go. And tragically, though, Peter lost his life in a Formula car race in France and Canada's great hope was gone. So this car really represents a tremendous era, really the era that where gentlemen drivers were still pretty much the norm, that it wasn't pay-for drivers. It wasn't there were no sponsorships, as you can see. I mean, this is the way the car looked in 1962. And so it really was the end of an era, because after this car, then the speeds really started to go up, and most of the cars were powered by American V8 engines, Chevys or Fords. And so this, as I say, represents a great era in motorsport and the hopes of Canada. So this is my 1966 Shelby GT350 Mustang. So as I said, my love affair with the automobile, the passion that I have for automobiles, street and racing, really came from my father. He began racing in the late 1950s. And so as I grew up all through the decade of the 60s, which I thought was just the most amazing decade when you looked at the progression technically of cars in 1960 versus 1970. And one of those cars that really kind of set the stage and also was reflective of the manufacturer's commitment to motorsports and high-performance cars in this country was the Ford Motor Company. And in association and partnership with Carroll Shelby, of course, they created the Cobra, which is still today one of the most sought-after cars ever. And as part of that program with Ford in 1964, they introduced the Mustang. And of course, it was just a huge success right off the bat. Now, the then plan, Lee Iacocca, was to make the Mustang into more of a sports car. And so he went to Shelby and said, "Can you do that?" And of course, Shelby, of course, would say yes to probably just about anything, and particularly if there was money involved. And the Mustang was produced in several different body shapes. There was a notchback, which was your basic Mustang. There was a convertible, of course, and then there was the fastback, the coupe. And so Shelby took the regular 260 cubic inch Mustang GT and upgraded the engine. It was a 289. They went 260 and then they went 289 in the street versions. He took the 289 and did various things, different manifold, different exhaust system, different carburetor, various other things to up the power to over 300 horsepower. And at the same time, in '65, produced the Shelby GT350. Now, the 65s are probably the most valuable GT350s because they were the first. And they were really a homologation special. They had to build so many in order to be able to qualify to race in SCCA racing and in racing in Europe. And so the 65 car had a locked rear end. It had side pipes instead of out the back, as this car does. And it was, no back seat. It had been lightened, had Coney shock absorbers. All these things were to differentiate the Shelby Mustang from the basic street Mustang. Great cars, I've had a couple, but with that locked rear end, not necessarily the nicest cars to drive on the street, but pretty impressive cars. In '66, however, and this is a '66 GT350, it was the same engine, same everything, but it had a back seat, and also you could fold down, so it was made for more luggage carry room or what have you. But it was pretty much the same car. Now the exhaust went out the back instead of out the sides. It didn't have the locked rear end, so it's a lot nicer car to drive around town. Pretty much the same engine, and I think the 66s were really a little bit more of a civilized version of the GT350s in '65. So this car is just, I love the color. This is kind of a classic Shelby color, the blue and the white. And of course, they built the GT350s for many years beyond this body style. But I think if you were to talk to any collector, it's this body style, the original GT, that really is the most sought after amongst all the Shelby Mustangs that were built. So the next car we're going to talk about is this car, one of my favorites, 1965 Alfa Romeo GTA. I've always been an Alfa Romeo nut. My dad actually raced an Alfa Romeo in the late 50s, a Giulietta Sprint. I remember my brother and I, little brother, and I would be in the back seat. My mom and dad would drive the car to the race. You got to the race, you taped up the headlights, you took the cap off the exhaust, you got rid of the kids and the wife and went off racing. And hopefully you didn't crash, because that was your way of getting back home. And of course, that's the way racing was in the 50s to a large degree. But anyway, a great car and lots of great memories. This car, an Alfa Romeo, is a very special car. This is a GTA. And the GTA Alfa Romeo came out with this model in 64 or thereabouts. And they wanted to make this a race car, and for the GT category in Europe particularly. But they needed to build 500 cars for the street that included the upgrades that they were going to use for the race car. And so Auto Delta, which was the racing arm of Alfa Romeo, did all the racing preparations for Alfa, took these cars off the assembly line and basically created hot rod, an Italian hot rod at the time. First off, the street car was all steel bodywork. This car was aluminum. They were trying to get rid of weight. And the way you can tell is in the drip rails here, you'll see the rivets holding the aluminum skin onto the steel frame. It also had plastic windows on the sides, lighter gauge glass on the front. It had, of course, a different modified rear suspension for better handling. The engine was really where the rubber met the road. However, the engine was an upgraded 1600cc street car engine, but in this case, it had a twin plug head, so 2 spark plugs per cylinder. Had a Morelli distributor off a Ferrari Dino, bigger Weber carburetors, a bigger oil sump. Various other modifications to up the horsepower considerably over the street version. They only made 500 of these cars in order to qualify the GTA for racing, and the GTA had tremendous success in racing around the globe. Really dominated the small bore GT category for many, many years. In fact, the basis of this car continued on through 1971. The engine went up to 2 liters later on. Of course, the GT-AM, which they call GT America, was very famous for its exploits in racing in the early 70s, 71, 70, around there. But again, what makes this car, even the door handles, if you look at the door handles there, it's just a little hook and a button. There's nothing fancy about this car. It's stripped down because they were trying to get the weight out of it for the GTA. This is called the Stradale. Stradale in Italian is the street version. It was also called the A in GTA was Allegorita, and that is lightweight. That means lightweight in Italian. So this car, how many of the original 500 still exist, I don't know. But this car is a really cool car, and if you love sports cars from the 60s, I think if you have a collection, you've got to have a GTA. Okay, so I said I was a huge Alfa Romeo fan. I'm probably just as huge of a Porsche fan. My father raced Porsches all during the 60s. I had a lot of success in Porsche racing cars in the 80s, winning the Daytona 24-hour in 1981, Sebring 12-hour in 87, and plus a number of other IMSA races in the mid to late 80s. So Porsche has always been a favorite brand for me. This car, probably when people think of Porsche, and whenever you see Porsche in the movies, it's usually in a car like this. This is the 356 Roadster. What makes this car so unique is that this is kind of the final development derivation of the Speedster, which really is the hallmark of Porsche in many people's minds. The Speedster came out in the mid-50s, early 50s, and of course the Speedster was very plain Jane. It didn't have roll-up windows. The top was manual. It was pretty simple, but what a great look and a lot of success in racing. with the 356, both the push rod and the 4-cam. The next kind of development of the Speedster was the convertible D, and that actually had roll-up windows. Now we're starting to get civilized, and the convertible D was just a great, that next kind of step. This car is the final derivation of the convertible D. This is a twin grill Roadster, and these cars, 248 of these cars were built. The body for these cars was built by the Porsche distributor from Belgium, the Petersen family, and that was it. This was the final hurrah. What made these cars kind of unique, however, is whereas the convertible D was based on the T5 body, which had a very narrow front luggage compartment, what have you, and various other things like different positioning for the fuel filler. This is the T6. The twin grill was the T6, which was common then with the next 356. So this kind of separates it, being the T6 body from the convertible D and the Speedster. It also has twin grills. It's named obviously for that. And again, the big thing is these cars, only 248 were made. And these may well be now the most valuable of the 356 series outside of the Carreras, because there were much fewer of these made than the regular Speedster or the convertible D for that matter. Powered by a 4-cylinder 1600cc Porsche engine, not the most powerful car in the world, 60 horsepower, this car, for example, but just a classic shape. And if you notice, unlike the 356s, there's no back seat. It's just a platform. Not even the passenger doesn't get a sun visor, only the driver, which probably tells you what they thought of passengers, I guess. No glove box. Still very simple, but really, when you drive this car, you get so many oohs and ahs and smiles from people, whether you're in the car or outside of the car. When you think of 48 Hours, when you think of Top Gun, what cars associated with those movies? It's a car like this. So great car. Like I said, not much on performance, but this car is all about everything else. So this may well be one of the most famous grills in automotive history, the kidney bean, and of course that means one thing, BMW, right? So this car, 1972 BMW 2002 TII. The TII was a hot-rodded version of the 2002. This car has special meaning to me. When I retired from racing, 1998, the first thing I did was go to a company up in Northern Illinois that restored BMWs, and I said, this is what I want. I want a 72 Inca 2002 TII, black interior, stock. I don't want it souped up, just the way it was. And the reason I wanted that is because a car exactly like this was my car pretty much throughout my 4 years at college. And I kind of jokingly say this is where I learned how to drive race cars, because I would take this car out, and Central Ohio, Southern Ohio had great roads, fabulous roads, lots of hills, you name it, and twisty turns, and just I would go out and just drive the hell out of this thing. And what was so cool about this car is not only did it handle well and it had 140 horsepower, which was, pretty sporty in the day, but you could put 4 or 5 people in this car. You could actually put probably 4 sets of golf clubs in the trunk. For me, it was great because when I would go back to school every fall, I'd stick my Marantz speakers in the back seat, my Girard turntable, my clothes, you could haul everything you needed to have for a year in college in this car. And then when you took it all out, you had a hot rod, you had a sports car. And so I think in BMW lore, the 2000, especially the 72 TII, is probably one of the most revered models they made. The 2002 really, in many respects, saved BMW anyway. but the TII was like the ultimate step. They built them from 72 to 75. The 72s and 3s are referred to as a round tail light, because if you'll see in the back, they had round tail lights, whereas after that they had big kind of square tail lights. And also the 72 did not have the extended bumpers. That happened in 73 when the federal regulations started requiring that kind of stuff. Of course, the 74 and 5 had even bigger bumpers, and which really kind of took away from the look in my mind. So the 72 is really the simplest, the purest version of the TIIs. And once again, this is a car that, I mean, it did everything. It just did everything, and it did everything really well. And so you drive this car on the road, you get thumbs up, everybody honks the horn, because a lot of people had a BMW 2002 or TI at some point in their past. And the passion that I have for BMW emanated from this car. After 72, I had a 75, I had a 77 320 Ti. I've had CSs, I can't even tell you, 750s, you name it. The love affair with BMW began with this car. And which is really why it was especially, I guess, satisfying or pleasing to me that many years later, RLL, our racing team, would be chosen by BMW to operate their racing programs here in North America. So it's come full circle. Interestingly, this car, when they introduced the BMW 1M, which they kind of referred back to that it was a new version of the TII, this car was on the car stand at the New York Auto Show alongside the new 1M. And also they did television advertising, and if you look it up, you'll see this car in the TV spot. So it's a bit of a movie star, this car, and loved driving this car every minute.